So I was thinking that Keynesian economics is definitely promoting new ideas in economics which have become popular after the Great Depression, in which the New Deal, it was successful macroeconomically. If you look at the unemployment rate and GDP growth, although individual government programs were definitely inefficient and wasteful, like agricultural subsidies, which were objectively just a failure because they're just government handouts to entitled people who lobbied the government to get more free stuff. And yeah, a lot of these welfare programs, they basically start with the New Deal. But one of the key tenets of Keynesian economics is the income equals expenditure expression, which recognizes that one man's spending is another man's income. So if everyone spends a lot of money, the economy thrives, but if no one spends money, then the economy goes in a deep spiral of doom, as people will become more conservative with their spending if their incomes fall. But then, if they spend less money, then other people have less incomes, and you get the idea. And where Keynesian policy comes into play is that the government has to intervene in the economy to conduct large spending, that large spending can't be varied based on economic pessimism, unlike investment or consumer consumption, as it just happens regardless. And obviously, taxes are imposed on the rich, heavy taxes, and businesses too, and that money's taken and it's used to make lots of government spending. And so ultimately, the economy is stimulated by the government. But one criticism that Milton Friedman had was, and this is one of many conveyed criticisms in Capitalism and Freedom, is that if a good or service is free by government expenditure, then it's not that the government has given money to people, but people just have less, they have more money left over because what they would usually spend money on is free and they have more money left over. And so they'll spend that money on things that they value less. And the example he uses is that a park which is previously privately owned is free as the government pays, it effectively pays for it. And so rather than people spending money on it, they have money left over that they spend on other things. But those other things they value less than spending on the park. And so they'll just spend it and they'll be a lot more wasteful with their spending because the things that they'll spend money on they value a lot less. And this is page 80, Capitalism and Freedom. And when you consider a balanced budget economy like in Keynesian economics, as it has in its earlier stages, then the example gets even worse, as when public spending comes from taxation, which is taxation of the private sector, then the total spending in the economy is basically the same, as the types of economic activity are less catered towards what the consumer wants and more towards what the politicians want. And the politicians boast grand spending ideas for more votes. And so government spending isn't really that more expansionary at all. But Friedman does incorrectly assume that government borrowing money means less money, as banks will have less money to invest. And he also assumes that banks invest all of the capital that they have, when in reality banks don't really invest all of the money they have, and government borrowing of money just means that money that is otherwise left idle is actually used towards more productive use. Although borrowing of money can increase overall expenditure on income and expenditure, as demand-side economics argues, I would like to argue that supply-side economics can increase overall expenditure as well through creation of more products and services. In my practical example, let's assume that in our economy, the only commodities that exist are bread and water. For example, suppose that Adam gets an income of $100 and spends 25% of that on bread and 25% of that on water. And the recipients of that money also spend 25% of their income on each. The total GDP of this cycle would be $200, which is the equivalent of 100 over 0.5. If the government imposed income taxes or exchanged bonds with the banks for that saved money, the government could repeat the process all over again. What if reduced government taxes increased incentive for innovation and market enterprise and new businesses formed? Well, Adam in this case would spend 5% of his income on bread, 5% of his money on water, 5% on electricity, 5% on computers, streaming subscriptions, furniture, clothing, heating, ice cream, computer games, and so on. Ultimately, Adam spends 90% of his income, rather than just 50%, on goods and services. And these goods and services, of course, are of lower prices. Assuming that other people have the same spending patterns, we could assume that the total nominal GDP is 100 over 0.1, which amounts to $1,000. With lower prices, the real GDP is even higher, $5,000 in this case, as bread and water are a fifth of that price. Ultimately, aggregate expenditure has increased thanks to the free market, and the economy is better from a demand-side perspective. That's not to say that demand-side economics is what we should be striving for, as the economy would be like that meme of the electrical cord plugged back into itself, where the same people just buy more of the same things. In my example, I have been very kind to ignore investment from banks, which would only explore even more shortcomings of Keynesian economics. I have even assumed that only the private sector innovates, but that's because the government-related innovation does not have any impacts on market activity. For example, space rockets or Soviet satellites or the NHS COVID test and trace flop. Anyway, thanks for watching. Leave a comment, let me know what you think, and bye bye.